Hi, this is Mr. Mack, and this is the concept video on solving linear equations. First of all, let's define what an equation is. An equation is actually one mathematical expression linked to another mathematical expression by an equal sign. Now, an example, for example, might be 3x plus 2 equals 20. Now, sometimes we refer to this equation as an open sentence. Because what it really says is that 3 times the number plus 2 is equal to 20. Now, 3 times the number plus 2 is equal to 20 might be true, and it might be false. See, now if x were 6, 3 times 6 plus 2 would be equal to 20. But if x were 5, 3 times 5 plus 2 wouldn't be equal to 20. So an open sentence is one that can be true or false. Now, the number or numbers that actually make an open sentence true are called the solutions. Sometimes they're referred to as roots as well. So if you hear somebody talking about roots, they're actually saying these are answers to some kind of an equation. A lot of times roots is the term used for polynomial equations of higher degree than 1, but we'll talk about that later. Now, since we are actually using the equal sign now, it makes sense to talk about what properties the equal sign, or what are the properties of equality. Well, now, the first property of equality is a property that's called the reflexive property. And this one's really pretty easy to handle. The reflexive, that's a V there. The reflexive property basically states that any number, A, is equal to itself. So anytime you have a number or an expression, you can set it equal to itself if you wish. The second property of equality is called the symmetric property of equality. And it's a conditional statement. It says if you have A and you know it's equal to B, then it's also perfectly acceptable to say that B has to be equal to A. Now, if you look at this carefully, this looks a little bit like the commutative property, but it isn't the commutative property because now A and B are moving around an equal sign rather than a plus sign or a multiplication sign. So if A is equal to B, then B is equal to A is the symmetric property of equality. The third property of equality is the property called the transitive property. Now, the transitive property kind of gives you a chain of linked equals. In other words, if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then by the transitive property, A has to be equal to C. That's the transitive property. Sometimes, instead of transitive, we'll just say substitution. But substitution is a little bit stronger than the transitive property. Maybe we should mention substitution in passing at this particular point. The substitution principle says if A is equal to B, then B may be replaced by A anywhere B appears. And it's pretty easy to get the transitive property out of that, but as you can see, the substitution principle is a little bit stronger. Now, the next property of equality that we want to talk about is oftentimes abbreviated APE. Now, this stands for the addition property of equality. And it basically says if you have an equation, if you have an equation, in other words, if you have A is equal to B, then A plus C will be equal to B plus C. Now, the way I thought of this when I was younger was that if you had an equation, it was okay to add the same thing to both sides of an equation. If you'll see here, the equation A equals B right here, what we've done is we've added C to the A and we've added C to the B to get A plus C is equal to B plus C. That's the addition property of equality. And that's kind of an important one. We use that a lot in solving equations. The next property of equality that we need to talk about is the multiplicative property of equality, which basically says if A is equal to B, in other words, if you have an equation, then A times C is going to be equal to B times C. Another way of looking at this is we're multiplying both sides of an equation by the same thing. So APE and MPE basically say to you, you may add or multiply both sides of an equation by the same thing. Now, since subtraction is just adding the inverse, if we added, right up here, if we added the opposite of C to both sides of A is equal to B, we'd get A minus C is equal to B minus C. So the addition property of equality will really let us also subtract the same thing from both sides of an equation. And since division is just multiplying by the multiplicative reciprocal, if we multiplied both sides of A equal B down here by 1 over C, we'd get A over C is equal to B over C. So it's easy to see that you could divide both sides of an equation by the same thing. Of course, you can't divide both sides by 0 because if C is 0, then 1 over C or 1 over 0 doesn't exist. So you can divide each side of an equation by any number except, of course, 0.